Picture yourself standing on the deck of a narrow wooden vessel, crossing a vast and freezing ocean with nothing to guide you but the stars overhead and the nerve inside your chest. No engines humming beneath you, no satellite blinking a route home, no map showing what lies past the horizon. Now picture that same vessel reaching shores that not a single soul in Europe knew existed. That image alone tells you this cannot simply be a story about brutal men swinging axes, because that popular picture only captures a sliver of who these people actually were. The Norse people we call Vikings were, in truth, sailors of extraordinary skill, boat builders, merchants, poets, and among the finest navigators the ancient and medieval world ever produced. They wove together an enormous web of trade stretching from the icy fjords of the far north down to the sun-baked markets of the Middle East. Yet somehow in the popular imagination they survive mostly as raiders and nothing more. So let's set the record straight and explore the true Viking Age, not only the bloodshed, but the daring, the ingenuity, and the sheer hunger for the unknown that defined an entire era. When most people hear the word Viking, an image springs to mind almost automatically: hulking warriors in horned helmets roaring into battle, axes swinging. The actual Vikings were people from the Scandinavian lands we now know as Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, and here's something that surprises many: not everyone living in those lands was automatically a Viking. The term itself functioned less like an ethnic label and more like an occupation or an activity. To go Viking meant setting off on a voyage abroad, whether for commerce, discovery, or plunder. Among these travelers you would find fierce fighters, yes, but also shrewd traders, farmers hunting for better soil, and restless souls simply drawn to see what waited over the water. But flip the perspective and it looks different. To the Norse newcomers, Europe's monasteries were stuffed with treasure and guarded by almost nobody. These raids weren't senseless chaos, they were calculated opportunity. Soon longships were appearing along coastlines everywhere: England, France, Ireland, deep into Eastern Europe, and eventually far beyond the continent altogether. Yet contrary to what film and television suggest, the average Viking spent far more time trading goods than swinging a weapon. And once you accept that fact, the entire narrative shifts. Certain designs were built to endure the open ocean, while others were shallow enough to slip up rivers that would strand any larger warship. This versatility gave Viking crews an enormous tactical edge. They could materialize from open water almost without warning, strike or trade swiftly, and vanish long before any organized defense could respond. But the ships weren't purely instruments of war, they were, above all, vehicles of discovery. Norse shipwrights pioneered a method called clinker construction, layering overlapping wooden planks to produce a hull that was both lightweight and remarkably tough, able to flex with the punishing swells of the North Atlantic instead of splintering against them. So why leave Scandinavia at all? Scholars still argue over the exact mix of motives, but a handful of powerful forces stand out. One was simple demographic pressure. Scandinavia's usable farmland was limited, and as families grew, competition for soil intensified. Younger sons frequently inherited little or nothing from their fathers, pushing them to seek fortune elsewhere. Some sought riches, others sought glory, still others simply wanted to know what lay past the edge of the map, and that curiosity alone was powerful enough to drive men and women farther and farther into the unfamiliar. What's remarkable is how open these seafarers were to absorbing knowledge from the very cultures they encountered. These were not isolated marauders cut off from the wider world. They were seasoned travelers plugged into the medieval global economy. Here's a piece of the story that rarely gets told. The Vikings were above all formidable traders. Their commercial routes snaked across Europe, through Russia, into the Middle East, and further still. Swedish Norse sailors in particular pushed eastward along the river systems threading through what is today Russia and Ukraine, trading furs, honey, amber, walrus tusks, and enslaved captives in exchange for silver, silk, wine, and luxury craftsmanship. Some Norse warriors were so impressive that they were recruited into the emperor's own elite personal guard, the famed Varangian Guard. Just sit with that image for a moment. A warrior born amid the ice and fjords of Scandinavia ending up as a trusted bodyguard to the ruler of one of history's wealthiest empires, thousands of miles from home. That is the scale of the world the Norse people built for themselves. Meanwhile, Danish raiders and settlers concentrated their efforts on Western Europe and England, while Norwegian explorers pushed deep into the Atlantic. Even now, a surprising number of everyday English words trace back to Old Norse: sky, window, knife, husband, among many others. The Viking imprint is woven into daily life in ways most people never even notice. What came next was even more astonishing. These seafarers were about to push into some of the harshest, most unforgiving terrain on the planet and somehow carve out entirely new societies from nothing. In the closing decades of the 9th century, Norwegian explorers began arriving on the shores of Iceland, an island that was, at the time, essentially uninhabited apart from a handful of monks who may have briefly lived there. Try to imagine landing on a volcanic island swept by freezing winds, almost entirely barren of trees, and simply deciding, we will make our lives here. It sounds close to impossible, Yet these settlers adapted, building farms, raising sheep and cattle, forming tight-knit communities, and crucially preserving their stories in writing. Iceland eventually became the birthplace of the Norse sagas, sprawling tales of heroism, family feuds, exploration, and daring sea voyages. Without those Icelandic writers, an enormous portion of Viking history might have vanished entirely from human memory. The Norse were about to attempt something even bolder, sailing even farther west, toward a brutal expanse of ice and stone called Greenland, and beyond that toward a continent Europe didn't yet know was out there. That next chapter belongs to the explorer Erik the Red, the founding of the Greenland settlements, and the extraordinary Norse voyage to North America roughly 5 centuries before Columbus ever set sail. By this point, the Norse were no longer merely sailors. They were becoming genuine discoverers of uncharted territory, and what they found across the Atlantic would leave a permanent mark on world history. Picture standing at the very edge of everything Europeans understood about the world, Greenland behind you, a brutal landscape of ice and endurance, and ahead of you an endless dark sea that no chart in Europe could account for. Centuries before Columbus, long before anything resembling modern navigation existed, these voyagers may have become the very first Europeans to set foot in North America. Yet this expedition wasn't simply about exploration for its own sake. It was tangled up with survival, ambition, banishment, and an unshakable human drive to see what lies beyond the known world. Every remarkable era of discovery needs someone willing to gamble everything, and for the Norse that figure was Erik the Red. Contrary to what the nickname might suggest, it had nothing to do with violence. It referred to his striking red hair and beard. Now picture being cast out of your homeland with your future thrown into total uncertainty. Most people in that position would fold. Erik instead sailed west into open, unknown water in search of new territory, and what he stumbled upon would become one of the most legendary discoveries in the entire Norse story: Greenland. Today we picture Greenland as an overwhelmingly icy landmass smothered by glaciers, but when Erik arrived around 982 CE, he found stretches of fertile coastline well suited to farming and settlement. One Old Norse account even notes that people would be far more willing to move somewhere with an appealing name attached to it, arguably making this one of history's earliest recorded marketing campaigns. And remarkably, the strategy worked. Settlers soon began arriving from Iceland, bringing sheep, cattle, tools, timber, and entire families with them. Against staggering odds, Norse communities took root and grew along Greenland's coastline, surviving there for centuries in one of the most punishing environments anywhere on Earth. Settlers constructed homes from stone and turf because usable timber was scarce, raised livestock through the brief summer months, and carefully stockpiled food for the long winter ahead. A single harsh season could spell disaster, and yet these Greenland communities endured for hundreds of years, a genuinely remarkable feat of human resilience. Greenland turned out to be more than a survival story, though it became a launching point for even more ambitious exploration because the settlers began noticing something odd. Sailors also began reporting glimpses of distant land far off to the west. Curiosity built steadily. Was there truly another landmass across the ocean? To most medieval Europeans, the Atlantic seemed limitless and impassable, yet the Norse kept probing the question, and eventually one voyage would finally deliver an answer. Days passed, thick fog rolled over the water, and then unexpectedly his crew spotted land that matched nothing they recognized: forested terrain, rolling hills, an unfamiliar coastline. Timber, remember, was an extremely precious resource back in Greenland, so this discovery should have been monumental. Yet in a strange twist, Bjarni chose not to go ashore at all. He simply turned his ship around and continued on to Greenland. Leif had grown up surrounded by tales of daring voyages and discovery. His father, after all, had founded Greenland itself, and now Leif wanted to achieve something even greater. He purchased Bjarni's old ship, assembled a crew, and set sail westward into the unknown, launching a voyage that would become the stuff of legend. According to the Norse sagas, Leif first reached a rocky, barren coastline he named Helluland, which many historians now identify with present-day Baffin Island. From there he continued south to a heavily forested region he called Markland, likely corresponding to Labrador in modern Canada, and for a Greenland settlement starved of timber, forests like these represented enormous value. Consider how staggering this is. Nearly 500 years before Columbus, Norse sailors had already crossed the Atlantic and reached the Americas, not through blind accident but through purposeful, determined exploration. For generations, skeptics dismissed these saga accounts as pure legend, but modern archaeology eventually proved them true. During the 1960s, researchers uncovered genuine Norse remains at L'Anse Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, structures built in unmistakably Norse style, along with authentic artifacts confirming that these sailors truly had reached North American shores. The sagas, it turned out, weren't myth at all. The Norse established temporary camps and explored the surrounding territory. Some historians think these settlements were purely seasonal outposts, while others argue there were attempts at something more permanent. Regardless, life in Vinland presented its own serious challenges. The distance separating it from Greenland was immense, supplies were limited, and critically, the settlers were not alone in this new land. With settlements too small and isolated to hold their ground, maintaining a permanent colony across such a vast stretch of ocean proved unsustainable, and over time the Vinland outposts were abandoned. Even so, despite never becoming a lasting settlement, the achievement itself permanently reshaped history. Norse sailors had crossed the Atlantic centuries before any other Europeans managed the feat. Perhaps strangest of all, the wider European world barely registered the accomplishment. News of the discovery never truly spread beyond Norse circles in the North Atlantic, remaining largely a regional story rather than a continental one. In many respects, that outlook distinguished the Norse from much of medieval Europe. While other kingdoms fought endlessly over fixed borders, Norse explorers kept pressing outward across rivers, oceans, and frozen seas, their longships becoming enduring symbols of fearless discovery. Even now, these voyages continue to captivate historians, sailors, and adventurers across the globe. Because when people imagine exploration today, they usually picture enormous modern vessels or spacecraft. Yet the Norse achieved extraordinary feats using nothing more than timber, sailcloth, raw courage, and instinct. No advanced instruments at all, just sheer determination powerful enough to challenge the unknown. But while some Norse sailors were charting unfamiliar waters to the west, others were quietly reshaping Europe itself from within. In the earliest days of the Viking Age, Europe genuinely feared these seafarers. Monks offered desperate prayers whenever longships appeared on the horizon. Kings scrambled their defenses. Coastal villages went up in flames. They built towns, intermarried with local populations, established bustling trade hubs, and eventually rose to become rulers in their own right. The very people once dreaded as violent sea raiders would go on to become kings of England, founders of major cities, and influential figures shaping the trajectory of medieval Europe. And here's perhaps the biggest surprise of all. The Viking Age didn't end because these people were militarily crushed. It ended because they fundamentally transformed. In the earlier phase of Norse expansion, many expeditions centered on swift, opportunistic raids. A fleet would appear without warning, strike hard and fast, seize whatever valuables it could carry, and vanish before any organized resistance could form. Rather than continuing to plunder foreign territories again and again, growing numbers of Norse settlers chose to establish permanent lives there instead. England became one of the clearest examples of this shift. Large Norse armies, particularly from Denmark, arrived throughout the 9th century, but these were no longer fleeting raiding parties. They brought entire families, farmers, and skilled craftsmen along with them, seeking land rather than loot. Vast stretches of England eventually came under Norse control in a region that became known as the Danelaw, governed by distinctly Norse laws and customs. Many people picture Norse life as confined to small, isolated villages buried in snow and mountains, but in reality these settlers also played a major role in founding significant urban centers. As their trading networks expanded, Norse settlements grew into genuinely important towns and cities. Dublin in Ireland is a prime example. What began as a Norse base for ships and commerce eventually blossomed into a thriving economic hub packed with merchants, blacksmiths, shipwrights, and skilled artisans, becoming one of the most significant trading centers anywhere in the Norse world. Picture strolling through Norse-era Dublin. Ships crowding the harbor, blacksmiths hammering away at glowing iron, merchants hawking silk, silver, furs, jewelry, and glassware imported from distant lands, and a mix of languages drifting through the streets from across Europe and beyond. Archaeologists have unearthed intricately detailed Norse jewelry, carvings, weapons, and tools that reveal genuinely impressive artistic sophistication. Dragon motifs carved into ship prows, elaborate interlocking knotwork, runic inscriptions, art that reflected both raw power and vivid imagination. As these settlements accumulated wealth, Norse influence across the continent became impossible to overlook. While Norwegian explorers pushed into the Atlantic and Danish groups concentrated on England, Swedish Norse traders moved eastward along the great river systems reaching deep into Eastern Europe, eventually becoming known as the Varangians. Using these rivers as highways, they traveled through what is now Russia and Ukraine, pressing all the way toward the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire. Once again, these travelers proved themselves to be far more than simple raiders. They functioned as connective tissue between distant worlds, linking Northern Europe with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world through sustained trade relationships. Picture a Norse traveler from the icy fjords of Scandinavia wandering the golden avenues of Constantinople, towering churches, crowded bazaars, the mingled scents of spices and perfumes carried from across Asia. For many of these travelers, the experience must have felt almost otherworldly, and some chose to remain there permanently. Byzantine emperors were so taken with Norse fighting prowess that they recruited them as an elite personal guard, the legendary Varangian Guard, tasked with protecting the emperor within one of the wealthiest empires on the planet, a clear measure of just how highly these warriors were regarded. Everyday words like sky, window, knife, egg, law, and husband all trace their roots back to Old Norse. Even our days of the week carry this influence. Thursday derives from Thor, the Norse god of thunder, meaning millions of people casually invoke the name of a Norse deity every single week without even realizing it. That's a testament to just how deeply this culture became embedded in the fabric of European life. And it wasn't limited to language alone. Norse storytelling traditions shaped medieval literature and legend for centuries afterward. This is also where the Norse world began undergoing a dramatic religious transformation. For most of this era, Norse society followed its traditional pagan beliefs, honoring gods such as Odin, associated with wisdom and warfare, Thor, god of thunder, and Freya, goddess of love and magic, a mythology populated with giants, monstrous beings, mystical realms, and prophecies foretelling Ragnarok, the eventual end of the world. These stories formed a core part of Norse identity. But as settlers spread further across Europe, contact with Christianity grew increasingly frequent. Over time, leaders across Denmark, Norway, and Sweden adopted Christianity. Churches gradually replaced pagan temples, and crosses began appearing in places where symbols of Thor's hammer once stood. Yet many older customs persisted quietly within these new Christian societies. The shift unfolded gradually rather than overnight, with old and new belief systems coexisting for generations before Norse culture became fully woven into medieval Christian Europe. As Norse society grew more structured, powerful monarchs began to emerge in place of scattered raiding bands and local chieftains. Norway unified under rulers such as Harald Fairhair, while Denmark consolidated its power under figures like Harald Bluetooth. And yes, modern Bluetooth wireless technology is genuinely named after this Danish king, since Harald united disparate Danish territories much the way the technology unites different devices, a small but real fragment of Norse history hiding inside your phone. Yet this very transformation also signaled the beginning of the end for the Viking Age as it had traditionally existed, because once these people settled into structured kingdoms, they gradually stopped living according to the old raiding, exploring lifestyle. The era defined by relentless voyages and expeditions was slowly giving way to something more settled. Eventually we arrive at the closing chapter of this story, the decline of the Norse Age, what ultimately happened to the Greenland settlements. Yet even after the Viking Age itself faded into history, the legend surrounding these people never truly disappeared, and that legacy continues shaping our modern world in ways both obvious and subtle. For nearly 3 centuries, Norse sailors struck fear into distant kingdoms, crossed treacherous oceans, established sprawling trade networks, discovered unfamiliar lands, and fundamentally reshaped the map of Europe. Their ships dominated the seas. Their stories traveled across continents. Major voyages became increasingly rare. The Norse Age gradually dissolved into history. What caused this decline? How did one of history's most formidable exploring cultures reach its end? By the 11th century, Europe had transformed dramatically from the world early Norse raiders first encountered. Back in the 700s and 800s, many European kingdoms were fractured and vulnerable, their coastal monasteries poorly defended, and communication painfully slow, conditions that had allowed early raids to succeed with relative ease. Over time, however, European powers adapted. Armies grew stronger. Simultaneously, Norse society itself was evolving. The descendants of the original raiders had become farmers, merchants, rulers, and practicing Christians. The older lifestyle built around seasonal raiding simply no longer suited the newly organized Scandinavian kingdoms. Rather than setting out as independent adventurers, increasing numbers of Norse people now lived within structured monarchies governed by formal laws, taxation, and centralized authority. Harold lived an extraordinary life, fighting in numerous battles across Eastern Europe and even serving within the legendary Varangian Guard in Constantinople, accumulating wealth, battlefield experience, and considerable renown along the way. Yet Harold wanted more still. He set his sights on the throne of England itself. In 1066, he launched a massive invasion involving hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors, and for a fleeting moment, it genuinely appeared as though Norse forces might reclaim dominance over England once more. His army secured an early victory, but then came the brutal Battle of Stamford Bridge, where English forces led by King Harold Godwinson caught Harold's army by surprise. Ironically, England would still fall to conquest later that same year, not to fresh invaders from Scandinavia, but to descendants of Norse settlers who had long since made their home in Normandy. Generations earlier, Norse settlers had established themselves throughout northern France, giving rise to a region literally named Land of the Northmen. Over successive generations, these settlers absorbed French language and customs, converted to Christianity, and built formidable armies and fortresses, all while carrying Norse ancestry quietly within their bloodline. In 1066, a Norman ruler named William launched his own invasion of England, and history remembers him as William the Conqueror. His decisive victory at the Battle of Hastings permanently altered the course of English history. So, in a curious twist of fate, Norse bloodlines and cultural influence continued shaping Europe long after the traditional Viking Age had technically ended. They hadn't vanished so much as evolved into something new. To this day, no one knows precisely why, and that unanswered mystery continues to intrigue historians. Several contributing factors seem likely. Climate shift was probably significant. A colder period known as the Little Ice Age made farming considerably harder and ocean travel far riskier. Growing isolation likely played a role too, since Greenland sat so remote from mainland Europe that trade visits became increasingly infrequent, making essential supplies harder to obtain. When later European explorers finally returned to Greenland generations afterward, the Norse colonies were simply gone, as though the frozen landscape itself had swallowed them whole. And yet, for several centuries beforehand, these people had managed to survive in one of the most punishing environments found anywhere on Earth, an achievement that remains genuinely extraordinary regardless of how their story ultimately ended. So why does the fascination with these people endure so powerfully even now? Because their story carries a scale and intensity that feels larger than ordinary history: adventure, discovery, mystery, sheer survival against the odds. They linked distant civilizations through trade and travel long before anything resembling globalization existed. And unlike many other medieval societies, they left behind vivid, enduring narratives. Their sagas preserved heroes, explorers, monstrous foes, daring voyages, betrayals, and legends that continue inspiring films, video games, novels, and television series today. But perhaps the deepest reason we still remember them comes down to something simpler. They embody raw human curiosity, that persistent desire to push further and discover what waits beyond the horizon. Try to imagine how genuinely terrifying the open Atlantic must have looked in the year 1000. No reliable charts, no guarantees, no rescue if something went wrong, and still these sailors pressed westward regardless. Their discoveries reshaped the history of exploration. Their trading networks linked distant civilizations together. Their settlements helped shape entire nations. Their language left a permanent mark on English. And the deeper historians dig, the clearer one truth becomes: these were never simply violent raiders. They were explorers, skilled navigators, ambitious traders, gifted storytellers, and determined settlers, people willing to confront the unknown head-on. And perhaps that's precisely why their legacy refuses to fade, because on some fundamental level, humanity continues to admire those brave enough to sail past the edge of the known map. The Norse Age began with ships materializing suddenly out of the sea and closed with their descendants ruling kingdoms scattered across Europe. From Scandinavia to North America, from the frozen coastlines of Greenland to the bustling markets of Constantinople, these people left their mark across the medieval world, not solely through conflict, but through exploration, commerce, and discovery. And even 1,000 years later, their story still seems to call out from across the ocean, as if somewhere beyond the horizon, a lone longship is still sailing onward into the unknown.